forest grows up and then it burns down. And I am here in a ghost town. Jack pine cones release their seeds into the embers on
The photograph depicted here was taken in 1942 of the Jackfish Road Camp, located at Jackfish, Ontario, just east of Thunder Bay. The camp operated between April 18th and June 2nd of 1942 and was a labor camp for young Japanese Canadian men created as part of the War Measures Act. The photograph was found in one of the family photo albums belonging to a man named Terry Adachi, the subscript under it reading, "The Road Gang." It can also be assumed that multiple men at the camp had a copy of this photo, since the photograph can be located in the archives of the Toronto Star. On an initial glance, you would never guess how horrible their situation was, from the jovial way Terry and his friends are smiling. Terry Adachi lived from 1918 to 2008 and documented his adolescence and adult life through photography. His grandparents and parents came to Canada, and he was of the Nisei generation, Nisei meaning a Canadian-born Japanese Canadian. Terry was born in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, and his family lived in Port Alice, BC, when he was a small child. They returned to Totoriken, Japan, where he lived from the ages of 6 to 10. Terry then moved back to Vancouver, BC as a teen, and stayed in Canada for the rest of his life. In the summer of 1942, he worked at the road camp in Jackfish and farmed in Valletta and Merlin, Ontario as well, before moving to Toronto that same summer. Adachi is remembered as an avid Blue Jays fan and a wonderful artist.
Jackfish was a little town before the people moved on out, hiding amidst the bushes and the trees.
Jackfish is located along the shore of Lake Superior in Ontario. Jackfish was once founded as a fishing community in the 1800s and became prosperous when the first railways were built through the town. The town flourished for 60 years, hitting its peak in the 1920s. Jackfish supplied coal for the Canadian Pacific Railways. Trains would stop at this point in Jackfish, and men in cranes, sometimes 300 of them, worked non-stop every day to load the trains with coal. The town relied heavily on this industry, and the switch to diesel ruined them, as did the construction of the transatlantic highway. Due to the introduction of lamprey in Lake Superior, fishing became hard and could not be relied upon as a second industry either. During these difficult times, the Lakeview Hotel, which was built in the 1800s, kept the town alive through tourism. But the hotel burned down in the 1960s, and the last few families left in 1963. Completely abandoned, Jackfish was left to fall apart. All that remains now are broken down remnants of rusty cars and the foundations of wooden and stone homes, which are taken over by the surrounding forest.
Japanese people were once sent here to build the highway we hold so dear.
During the Second World War, Jackfish became the location of both a road camp and an internment camp. Before the war, Canadian-Japanese men worked on the transatlantic highway in Jackfish from 1932 to 1938. The pay was $5 an hour. It allowed men to make just a little bit of money during the Great Depression, when work was scarce. During the War Measures Act was created in 1942, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It took effect in both Canada and America, and foresaw that all Japanese immigrants, enemy aliens, as they were referred to by the government, and citizens of Japanese descent, should be forcibly removed from their homes and interned.
when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them American citizens, one-third aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
In 1942, 23,000 persons of Japanese heritage, largely Canadian citizens, and a majority of whom were Canadian-born, were taken from their homes in BC and put into internment zones. Internment was often gendered for the Japanese. While the women and children lived in the camps, men were forced into labor at these road camps all across Ontario. Japanese men, ages 18 to 45, were removed from the West Coast 100-mile protection zone. Those in Jackfish were forced to work on the Schreiber-Jackfish Highway project, one of the first projects proposed for Nisei prisoners. Although the camps were technically voluntary, men who didn't want to go were often forcibly apprehended. The men were offered more freedom in the road camps than the families were in the internment zones. This is because the men were allowed to travel to various towns nearby with permission on curfew, which then again is not very much freedom at all. The hard labor was cheap work, and in contrast to the $5 an hour of 1932, men earned 25 cents an hour, but they had to pay for their meals, which consequently cost 25 cents per meal. They also had to pay $20 a month for their families' living expenses in the internment camps. The food was poor. One prisoner, Bobby Jones, remarked in a letter to his family, "I've been living on crackers and prunes for the last month. The food is sure lousy, greasy, and smells. I have skin and bones." Sleeping conditions were also poor. There was no electricity, no running water, so the prisoners had to get the water from the lake nearby. The walk to the work sites were 5 or 6 miles, and due to this, men often became exhausted or sick. These budget cuts were put into place in order to protect the British Columbia Security Commission from financial responsibility. The BCSC minimized costs as much as possible. In one report, the Deputy Minister of Labour wrote, "We do not wish to allow malnutrition to develop to the extent of causing a fatality, which would result in burial expenses." German POWs and whites also worked at these road camps. The white workers were treated better than the Japanese workers and were given more desirable living spaces and jobs. Sometimes there was conflict between the Japanese and white workers. In censored letters, men described the camp to family members as a hellhole, a concentration camp even. One man named Tad wrote to his family saying, "Any time you are enjoying hot running water, just think of us, shivering in the wilds off far away in Ontario, and feel sorry for us." After men were finished working at the camps, they would be sent to work at sugar beet farms and pulp mills. This work was hard labor, and many men preferred not to go. Terry Adachi himself worked on a beet farm in the summer of 1942, after attending Jackfish. The irony of all this is that these men were forced into constructing the highway, when Jackfish's downfall came about by diesel and the construction of this very same highway. You could say that while Jackfish disappeared, the Japanese-Canadian population grew and went on to tell their ancestors' stories. After his work at the beet farm, Terry moved to Toronto to study painting and drawing. Throughout the 1960s to the 1980s, he went to Central Technical High School and the Ontario College of Art and learned the art of sumi-e, a Japanese style of ink brush painting. He also learned the Chinese style of ink brush painting. Terry worked at an art department, which specialized in full-service advertising, catalog, photography, and printing. Terry drew the commercial art by hand and was very skilled. In his later life, Terry participated in Japanese Canadian cultural activities and sumie art shows. Terry documented his life, including his marriage, through photography, which he carefully organized in 3 large family albums. After his death, Terry's daughter, Kathy Adachi, discovered these albums and brought them to the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, which is why we have access to these stories today.
Nothing dies, there's only change.
Hello. If you've made it to the end of this recording, I want to thank you for listening. This podcast was created as a collaborative effort between York University students and the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. The sources I've used to help me gather information for the podcast are displayed on the screen now. For further in-depth reading about the Jackfish Road Camp, I suggest checking out Citizenship Denied, a paper written by Lucy Warrington and Benjamin Bryce from the University of British Columbia. All the audio sources I've used are also displayed on the screen now. The first song that you hear at the beginning of the podcast is called Jackfish by the artist The Song of Ontario. I've also used recordings of Japanese folk songs, the first one called Tamping a Railroad Track Ground, and the second one, A Song of the Stonemason. These songs are taken off an album titled Japanese Work Songs, published by Ryotori Hattori in 1991. All recordings from the album were made in the 1950s and early 1960s. If you are interested in learning more about Japanese Canadian history, you can visit the JCC website, jcc.on.ca, to either explore resources or book a visit to the Cultural Center. The JCC archives are accessible to the public through the URL jcc.on.ca/heritage/archive. My name is Gina Florsky, and once again, thank you very much for listening.